Welcome to the 461st of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome historian of Latin America and disasters, Mark Healy. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live on Twitter and on the COVID Calls YouTube channel. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. As always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of March 9th, 2022, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, in Argentina, 126,901 people have lost their lives to COVID-19. In Brazil, 653,134 people have died from the disease. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that now. The headline, Fernando Solanas, Argentine filmmaker and politician, dies at 84. This was written by Daniel Politi and appeared in the New York Times, December 4th, 2020. When Argentina's Senate debated the legalization of abortion in 2018, Fernando Solanas, then a senator, argued fervently in favor of the proposed law, in part by declaring that sexual pleasure was a fundamental human right. The bill was rejected, but Mr. Solanas' speech and its unusual argument quickly went viral in a nation bitterly divided by the issue. Mr. Solanas was a consistent voice on the left, often speaking out in favor of human and environmental rights, whether in politics. Excuse me. Mr. Solanas was a consistent voice on the left, often speaking out in favor of human and environmental rights, whether in politics or in his other life as a filmmaker, whose movies and documentaries marked a new era in Latin American cinema. He died of complications of COVID-19 on November 6, 2020 in Paris. Argentina's foreign ministry said in a statement he was 84. Fernando Ezequiel Solanas was born on February 16, 1936, in Olivos, Buenos Aires province. His father, Hector, was a surgeon, and his mother, Maria Julia Zaldaragia, was a painter and poet. Mr. Solanas briefly studied law before attending the National Conservatory of Dramatic Arts. He graduated in 1962 and went into advertising. That work allowed him to raise enough money to make La Hora de los Hornos, The Hour of the Furnaces, a 3-part documentary about neocolonialism and political violence that he directed with Octavio Patino. Running 4 hours and 20 minutes in all, the film was released in 1968. Described as a unique film exploration of a nation's soul by Vincent Canby in the New York Times in 1971, the movie made a splash abroad, but was officially banned in Argentina, which was then under military rule, although it received clandestine screenings. Mr. Solanas and Mr. Gedino founded the influential Grupo Cine Liberación, the Liberation Film Group, and went on to coin the term Third Cinema to describe a burgeoning Latin America film movement with a revolutionary undercurrent and an ambition to break free from production standards set in Hollywood and Europe. After receiving death threats, Mr. Solanas went into exile in Europe in 1976 as a brutal military dictatorship took hold. He returned to Argentina in 1983 and went on to film some of his best-known work, including Sur, for which he won the Best Director prize at the Cannes Film Festival in 1988. Solanas was actually shot 6 times in the legs. The perpetrators were never caught, but he blamed Carlos Menem, the president at the time, whom he bitterly opposed. 2 years later, his formal political career began when he won a seat in the Chamber of Deputies, Argentina's lower house of Congress. Mr. Solanas, known by the nickname Pino, returned to filmmaking after his 4-year term ended. He made another foray into politics with a run for the presidency in 2007, but he garnered less than 2% of the vote. He went back to the lower house of Congress in 2009 and was elected a senator in 2013. He was appointed ambassador to UNESCO last year. Obituary of Fernando Solanas, who died in November 2020 of COVID-19. Okay, I'd like to turn to the conversation for today, and let me introduce my guest, Mark HEALEY. Mark HEALEY is an urban, environmental, and political historian of Latin America, and also a disaster scholar. The author of The Ruins of the New Argentina, which appeared with Duke Press in 2011, he's currently writing a book about the environmental and political history of water in the dry lands of Argentina, as well as a project about the transnational political history of housing and development. He has taught at New York University, the University of Mississippi, UC Berkeley, and since 2011, the University of Connecticut, where he is now the head of the history department. Mark HEALEY, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on COVID Calls.
It's a pleasure to be here and an honor. This has been a great space of conversation, and I'm glad to join it.
It's kind of you to say. Let me start the way I generally do, find out where you're calling from and how it's looking there pandemic-wise.
So I'm calling from Storrs, Connecticut, the campus of the University of Connecticut, snowbound, which feels a little bit like Narnia right now. Kind of one last snowstorm, a sort of, of an endless winter. A little more lovely, perhaps, than at other moments. And on the tail end of course, we hope, of at least this phase of our endless pandemic. We're, in the moment that much of the U.S. is living now, where we've decided that the pandemic is more or less over. And so this past week, the state of Connecticut has, the governor lifted, he had some time ago devolved to towns whether there would be any mask mandates, and had kept a sort of statewide mask mandate on schools, and he lifted that this past week, and then all of the schools very promptly lifted their mask mandate. Cases are dropping so far, but we shall see how that goes. Here on campus, we've actually been quite successful, within the, for some definitions of success. And I think compared to some other institutions, our leaders have been fairly astute in protecting students and faculty in the broader community, and we've had a vaccine mandate this year. We've had very few cases. We were, like many places, we fairly early on developed our own wastewater surveillance system, which has been very effective, and all through, especially last academic year, when there were a higher number of cases, that was used to kind of monitor and intervene. So it's been a relatively placid, certainly not unaffected, and with a great deal of tragedy all around us, corner of the world, in our kind of rural part of northeastern Connecticut. But Connecticut, of course, has been a fairly hard hit state, especially early on, and continues to be, even now, a number of the cities have, so the places that have kept mask mandates are a number of Connecticut cities where you have populations of a higher population of Latinx and African American students, especially, and still lower levels of community vaccination. Largely because of kind of continuing access issues of the kind of things that we know and have been talked about here and have been talked about extensively and yet not yet fully effectively acted upon.
I think that, well, thank you for that, Mark. And I think people may have forgotten how harsh it was there in Connecticut in the early days of the pandemic in the United States. And I remember, if I'm not mistaken, it was one of the towns in Connecticut was one of the first places it almost had a cinematic quality to it. They talked about isolating the whole town. And do you remember which city that was? Because the notion of that was that, and we look back at that now, I'm like, you're going to isolate a town in Connecticut, you're going to stop the pandemic?
I mean, I think that was one of the coastal places too, right? I mean, a lot of this was
Yeah.
Fairfield County, right? There's the places closest into to New York.
Right.
And yeah, but it's an interesting and revealing kind of moment, right? Because it's also sort of consistent with the role that particularly that part of Connecticut has played in relationship to the greater New York metropolitan area. I mean, there are lots of urban centers, of course, and it's a very heavily now relatively densely populated area, but it's a densely populated area whose density is sort of premised on a lot of suburban communities, right? And significant levels of segregation and kind of zoned for a certain suburban imaginary. And so the idea that you could kind of contain things completely is entirely consistent with that kind of mode of land use and local governance. It's interesting to think about that, the kind of the politics of federalism and sort of devolution of authority and all of this, right? I mean, it just seems especially cynical almost at this point, right? The way that in some of these recent decisions, sort of the state deciding that they're not setting a state mandate means that immediately all the local municipalities are subject to great pressure to make changes. It's striking, this whole question throughout all of this of kind of the scale of the community. Like, what is what is the way of intervening to protect the community? Who is your community?
Right.
And how kind of impoverished our imagination, I think, remains about a lot of those questions.
Let me stay with that for a second. You and I have bonded over the fact that, well, you're a department head right now. I was a department head at Drexel University, where I was previously for 8 years. And I was department head there when this pandemic broke out. And talk about federalism, institutional federalism, and the devolution of responsibility. I mean, and I don't blame anybody where there was a lot of sense making going on, but, to get these emails where department heads were supposed to be making decisions about which staff should come in and not come in, as if we would be reading the CDC reports and making these decisions. Eventually, some standardized procedures emerged, and I would say Drexel did quite well in terms of taking care of its community, particularly in a dense urban environment. And so I'm not being critical of them per se, but that first month, all of a sudden I was like, I never thought this is what a department head had to do.
Right. Because you're operating as, and it's interesting to think about it, as a disaster scholar too, because it's you've become the first responder, and it's
mayor.
following. Yeah, you've become the mayor, and you're the sort of you're the authority figure, and therefore people kind of resort to you, even though you are, perhaps marginally better informed at best, right, than those around. I mean, I don't know what your sense of this was. I mean, this, one thing that was helpful about that role in all of this was I certainly had a sense, well, for a long time in this, right, of, kind of what's our purpose in all this? Like, how are we going to be able to help? We make donations, but you're kind of on lockdown for a while, and you're kind of connected with this broad process, but we're not health professionals. We can't take action on those things. We're kind of helping out with mutual aid projects or whatever. But the sense that I mean, I felt a real responsibility. Like, okay, well, we're protecting our people. Like, this is a group of people for whom I am responsible. Right. And so, I'm going to do my very best to figure out, how to help them navigate this. And that was exhausting, but in some ways helpful, right? In the sense of giving some sense of focus within this kind of, endless doom scrolling and, I don't know, other projects that people maybe got up to in the first couple of months of the pandemic.
I actually think that's not to place you and I under the microscope, but I mean, there's a lot of good sociology of disaster that shows, in that sort of acute phase of a disaster, if people don't have some sort of a governmental organizational structure, they'll build one because it's important that people have a role in that. So I guess we're talking about the good and the bad of being a department head and this is a little segment that we will eventually extract. And this is just for the department heads out there. And I know there's a lot of them who've dealt with this. So thanks for talking about that. I wanted to ask you also if you could share a memory outside of that role of this pandemic for you.
So I have two, I mean, infinite number, right? I mean, what, the one I guess, advantage, right, of our placement is that we've always been able to go outside. So, this has been a time of a great deal of hiking and biking and kind of solitude through the Connecticut countryside. Um, I had, but two things. One, kind of frenzy. It so happened that right around this time, 2 years ago, I had a project on a digitization uh, of community archives project with some colleagues in Argentina, and we brought together some digital stuff from here, and we brought up to two colleagues up from Argentina. We'd gotten some funding, and we were going to have a couple of days to get together and brainstorm and do grant proposals and so forth. So they got here. We spent a day of just tremendous brainstorming, and towards the end of the day, we get this email that said, "Oh, by the way, Argentina is closing its airspace to all flights in 48 hours." And so, this brainstorming turned into primarily a brainstorming of how in the world are we going to get them back in time, and what flights might there be, and so forth. So this very, kind of low key, absurdist version of a sort of movie plot of sort of racing against time, and of course it's an absurd race against time because as we know, like with all of the travel bans and so forth that were, they partly helped to spread the thing because
Right.
but
Yeah.
it was, so we had this sort of brainstorm, kind of like an hour of walking around the woods, and then like running around like crazy trying to calling travel agents and so forth, this kind of last frenzied moment of connection before the kind of larger links of our interconnected world broke off into a new configuration. And they both got back, within kind of 2 or 3 hours before. Well, went down in
Amazing.
Argentina, then actually went into an extremely hard lockdown, and did not receive international planes for several months afterwards. I mean, there were lots of people who were actually stranded abroad for months. So it was good that we did it. But it was a very strong moment of transition in all of this, right? Feeling like we're kind of frenzied, and then it's accomplished. So we breathe out, and then okay, well, yeah, actually, we're in a pandemic now.
Yeah.
Like, nothing to particularly celebrate about that achievement.
That story aligns with others I've heard. Thank you for sharing it, about just the experience that people had. Some who were unaware of what was about to happen, moving through airports, and then finding themselves, leaving one continent and arriving in another, literally to a different experience. But there is a sort of a Argo quality in what you were just describing. Like,
Yeah.
can we make it out? And then you make it out, and that jolt of adrenaline is something I guess people felt in many different ways. And for some people, it was going to the grocery store for the last time, or it was being in their office for the last time and shoveling books into a bag, or whatever it is. So going into a period of the unknown.
Yeah, but it suggested that, like, I mean, in the kind of cinematic version, you get across the threshold, and then you're in the space of
You're free,
achievement, relaxation. But in fact, no, you're in the space of like
diving
great
headlong.
unknowing and pandemic
Yeah.
tragedy and enormous complexity and emotional trauma, right? And not only emotional trauma, danger.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to historian of disasters and Latin America, Mark Healy, today. And I want to dive into your work, but let me just ask a question to get some of the landscape established here. I read some numbers at the top. The numbers are undercount, certainly. This pandemic has been terrible in Latin America and in South America.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think in this piece that Ed Young, right, had in the Atlantic this week, really kind of summarizing the sort of state of the lamentable state of things as we're turning to another direction and kind of attempting dangerously to overlook the lessons learned here. Had some great lines about the ways that disaster kind of spreads down through the fractures of society, right? That the pandemic disease does. And so a lot of it is that, right? I mean, it also, I think, was a particular conjunction in many Latin American countries between kind of eroded forms of political responsibility and effectiveness of the state, a certain perhaps overzealous drive for hard lockdowns, kind of clear performativity of control, combined with the fact that many Latin American economies, Argentina a little bit less than others, but all Latin American economies on some level have extremely high levels of informality. And so no matter what mechanism the governments would establish for kind of connecting with people, for subsidizing those who are at home, for kind of covering costs of those who are laid off temporarily, the fact that so many people were off the books in various ways meant that there were very limited efficacy of those efforts. I mean, different countries made different efforts. They found some strategies, but you just had this sort of dual governments that were striving for a kind of vision of order and an attempt to replicate some things that were happening internationally that kind of looked like public health, along with this sort of incredibly powerful structural forces pushing to undermine that by people, who needed to work and needed to get beyond that. And so that, I think, was sort of fundamental. That clash was fundamental to why the disease spread. And then that contributed to kind of this ongoing crisis of legitimacy, which has only really deepened, I think, in most Latin American countries. You've seen a number of presidential, Peru most famously, but you've seen several governments fall, enormously high levels of really a kind of very broad protest movements in various places, particularly in Colombia. And even governments that, like Argentina or Chile to a degree initially, that seemed like they were having a relatively effective response, have been left with this really catastrophic outcomes in ways that they still haven't quite reckoned with, right? I mean, the thing that's really striking to me in Argentina, or talking with friends and with colleagues, is just how, I mean, this is just such a vast scale catastrophe, and the kind of national conversation of it somehow has still not really reckoned with that. The political leadership certainly has not, and that disjuncture is, I think, fundamental to what continues to kind of power this on to new levels of problems. I mean, there are lots of ways in which Latin America did rise to meet the challenge. I mean, countries like Argentina and Chile, and surprisingly Brazil, that had some forms of universal healthcare did better than the U.S. on various fronts, for instance. But you still have this kind of enormous fracturing around these, and a kind of lack of visibility, and in some ways a kind of loss of some lessons that had been learned in public health beforehand, that have to be relearned again.
So, how useful is it to place these countries in relief? I mean, particularly, I'm thinking of to put Argentina and Chile and Brazil in one conversation. Is it even possible to do that when we think about COVID and COVID response? I mean, this has been on my mind a lot recently, thinking about sort of the getting beyond the national frame to talk about COVID, but holding the region somehow. So less than a continent, but more than a nation, to try to do some cross-border thinking, because I think it's important for a lot of reasons. One, because it opens the sort of environmental imaginary and also supply chain understanding, but it also helps capture the indigenous experience and the non-human experience in important ways that we will just never get to if we're focused on, this is the experience of Chile, this is the experience of Argentina, for example.
Right. No, I think that's true. I think that one thing that's striking, though, is the degree to which each of the conversations really focus things nationally. Like, so the kind of comparison with the neighboring country and what they were doing, what was happening there, or what wasn't happening there, as a kind of powerful weapon for local debates and disputes, was so deep in all these. So even though the actual strategies were quite different and the outcomes were often significantly different, the fact that people kind of insisted on making those national comparisons was itself, kind of a key element of how this played out. And a key element of kind of local disputes, in interesting and folkloric ways, right? I mean, Argentina, Chile did a lot of its vaccinations with Chinese vaccine, which was interesting. Argentina and Brazil to a degree early on with a Russian vaccine, and that had a whole kind of politics to it within the national context of. So the supply chain stuff also was a big topic of conversation. I mean, Argentina, like South Africa and India and some other countries, has capacity to manufacture things and is now doing the Russian one under and making components of what part of Moderna, I think, under license. So there was just all of these really interesting things about kind of prior histories and dreams of industrialization and the role that science might play, and what the kind of geopolitics of all this was that played heavily into discussions of what would seem like a kind of more mundane thing about, okay, let's do what we can to get vaccines and arms. No, it was never just about that. It was also about, like, what's our vision for what's our role in the global scene, what's our vision for what's the kind of political role of the pharmaceutical industry. Are the Russians conspiring to poison us all?
Right.
Why is the government not making a deal with, particularly with Pfizer? And Pfizer, as I'm sure you followed, right? Pfizer had followed very, very aggressive negotiating tactics with many Latin American countries, which felt a lot like kind of an old story of the IMF and so forth that helped deter that. So it was striking to see all of the, even just focusing on the kind of national context brought in so many of those comparative and supply chain questions tied to these kind of questions of national destiny. It was never about just kind of serving and helping local communities. It was always tied in with these kind of larger questions about what our national project is, and who we have solidarity with.
So you are the author of The Ruins of the New Argentina, which came out in 2011, and great book. And I've been asking historians, particularly when I get a chance to talk to them about disaster books, if they see that work somehow differently now through COVID. Not to rewrite the work, but maybe parts of it that look different to you now. And I want to ask you to talk about the book a little bit, and then how you see that history of that 1944 earthquake in Argentina somehow through the prism of COVID.
Yeah. So, okay. So first, a kind of funny, morbid, maybe, but funny side note of this, which is one of the figures who played a significant role in the book, who was a conservative intellectual, a jurist, and a Catholic militant who had been a kind of political figure, was a judge at the time of the earthquake, and ended up eventually becoming a senator, and was kind of a key observer and actor on various sides during this. In the late year of 1944, he spent the last half of 1944, his court was basically closed. And so he spent kind of in the mornings, he would go in and do some cases. This is sort of 6 months after the earthquake. In the morning, he would go in and do some work, and he'd, kind of hear an occasional case. In the afternoons, he went home, and with his entire city collapsed around him, he sat down to write an 800-page text called The Structure of the State. And so I always thought that was kind of funny.
As one does after a major disaster.
Yeah. I always so one thing is, I always thought that was kind of funny, and and I have a kind of, I appreciated it because it enabled me to sort of read his interventions in the various disputes of the day, and then the kind of shape of the city and nation that were emerging from the ruins against this kind of theoretical text that he was writing that, supposedly sort of set out the larger vision. And I have some sardonic kind of reference to it in the book about, who would do such a thing. But let's just say I have a much better sense of who would do such a thing now, right? I mean, it doesn't seem quite as absurd. And so there is a sense in which having lived through this kind of experience gives you a different sympathy or a different sense of what the kind of possibilities of different actors are. I think also, this experience, like the thing that we were talking about at the top, of our own experience as, sense making in this uncertain circumstance, and trying to forge a path forward, and trying to sort of gather, the folks around you and your allies and so forth to kind of suggest, okay, this is a thing that we need to do. We don't need to do that. And here's how we're going to best protect our people. And here's the sort of vision that we're going to produce out of it. Yeah, I mean, that was obviously, that sense making was a central thing that I wanted to get into in the book. And then I looked at the sort of process of reimagining and rebuilding community after this disaster and the ways that that led to these kind of broader political transformations. So I wouldn't say that was unexpected, but it gave me much greater insight into how those things played out, and the complexities of those tasks. I suppose on some level, maybe in the writing, I was maybe more cautious and empathetic than in some ways I kind of remembered the writing being. Like I thought I'd come down harder on these people. I went back and I looked and I was like, oh, actually I didn't. And so it was interesting to kind of return to the point that I'd actually made in the text, even though I remembered it as being more dismissive of these actors. No, at the time I actually, so it was a sort of a return to that empathy. The book is about the worst natural disaster up until our present pandemic, perhaps, in Argentine history. I think the other comparable ones would be yellow fever in the 19th century. Other various cholera outbreaks, although they weren't as devastating in terms of numbers as yellow fever was. Yellow fever is really the last kind of great comparable epidemic in Argentina, with deaths on a comparable scale. But outside of those public health emergencies, the San Juan earthquake was the worst natural disaster in Argentine history. And it destroyed this city, which was the capital city of a province in the Argentine interior that was not the largest or most prominent or economically dynamic areas of Argentina, but it was one of the two provinces at the center of the wine industry. And it also was a province that in the 19th century in particular had been the home of one of the kind of great figures of Argentine liberalism and of a number of kind of lions of Argentine liberalism. So this place that had a kind of larger than role in the national imaginary, and a presence on every Argentine table, and was leveled in the course of an evening. With 90% of the houses in the city destroyed, and a significant death toll. Exact numbers are still, as ever, disputed and unclear, but certainly between 5,000 and 10,000 dead. So on the scale of kind of, other world historical earthquakes, this is tragic for Argentina, but, not comparable with your average, 20th century Chinese earthquake or even, some of the worst earthquakes across the border in Chile. But within the Argentine context, it was devastating. Certainly in San Juan, it was devastating. And it came also at this moment of particular political transition. A few months after a military coup at the end of what had become a fairly corrupt, formally democratic regime. And the earthquake kind of came to symbolize what seemed to be the kind of social failings and frailties, fragility of this social order that had been built by kind of outward-looking liberal capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century Argentina. And the concrete disaster itself, the specific disaster itself, became a national cause, in part because the then Secretary of Labor of the military government, Juan Perón, launched a campaign to gather funds and in solidarity with the victims later on the day of the earthquake, and then used that to indeed run a sort of massive solidarity campaign, but also to kind of win media prominence and become the sort of spokesperson for a national transformation. And this was the beginning of what would be, a massively successful, if controversial, political career, and also that the ruins were kind of an invitation to transformation. It would be the beginning of what would be a broad political transformation of the country, and that the rebuilding the city would become a kind of model for a new way of making the nation. So the interesting thing for me in writing the book was everyone knew the story about the earthquake and knew the story of the origins of Perón in connection with the earthquake, particularly because it's a week after the earthquake at a concert organized for this campaign in solidarity that Perón meets Evita for the first time, then Maria Eva Duarte. So this has this great mythical power as the kind of beginning of this national transformation. But the striking thing in starting to work on the project and in writing it was that what had survived in the national imagination was that there was a tragedy, that Perón acted, showed up on the scene, met Evita, and then the story kind of vanished. And what had actually happened in the province, how this had played out, how the city had been rebuilt, what connection this had with the kind of national political transformation that Perón had led, had been not the subject of some local studies, but no serious scholarship, and had been ignored, even though Peronism itself was the central topic of Argentine social science and historical production for 40 or 50 years afterwards. So what I tried to do in the book was first and foremost, just bring that story of the disaster and the efforts to rebuild and the eventual rebuilding to a larger audience, but also to reckon with why it had been forgotten, and how this disaster could be both, invoked to be dismissed, and how such a traumatic experience could be so central to this kind of very common, often, daily discussed national political transformation and yet left behind. So I guess one thing, I have been distressed to see some of those same dynamics, of course, playing out in our present day, right?
Right.
There are ways. I mean, this is the point that everyone made that we all became kind of aware of, like with respect to the Spanish flu and the flu pandemic of 18, 19, 20, that it had always seemed puzzling how such a massive, even today, still larger scale than COVID public health disaster had such a kind of ephemeral presence in broader public conversation. And so I think, we've all been relearning that lesson.
Right.
And it's striking to think about it and to kind of take those insights back to some of our work and hopefully apply them in kind of thinking about how to respond to things now.
Let me just take a moment to remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to historian Mark HEALEY today, and we're just talking there about his book, The Ruins of the New Argentina. So it's a disaster that becomes a sort of part of national folklore. It also happens in the middle of World War II and in the middle of a wave of cyclical, I think you would call them revolutions in Argentine politics. So yeah. So I want to go a little further with this because I want to know, because I'm quite fascinated with the interplay here between sort of historiography, that is like what professional historians do, versus the sort of role of the state in crafting a history out of that disaster. And I'm asking you that for a very selfish reason, which is I think we're watching that in real time around the world right now with COVID. But often we look at it one case at a time, and it's challenging because the context will always be so specific and contingent. But now we do have an opportunity, and here I'm arguing with myself from 20 minutes ago about the national frame. But here's where I think the national frame is quite helpful, because we could take a look across many different countries, even just in Latin America right now, and see if this dynamic is playing, which you've described quite well. It's a simultaneous making of a new political framework, which involves erasure, of course, as always, of an old political framework. So where's the disaster in all of that?
Right. I mean, in the Argentine context, I think that part of the story in San Juan with Perón was that the disaster was much more massively present in the making of Peronism as a movement. And part of the reason that it ends up getting forgotten or sort of re-regionalized, although it was a very national story, and sort of turned into this kind of provincial thing that people in the province are only those folks are interested in, has to do with the role that it played successfully in kind of leading to a national transformation and offering it kind of early examples of some of the things, but much less successfully in actually carrying out that transformation on a local level. So it was sort of a prototype, which then ran into some of the problems inherent to any rebuilding project. There was an attempt to entirely move the capital to a new site. There was an attempt to, rebuild in entirely new modes of construction. This had been a city that was built largely in adobe mud, so attempt to rebuild everything in cement, which meant building factories, which meant mining, which meant all sorts of things that took some time. That made for a much less glorious short-term history. And so the kind of mundane success of the eventual rebuilding moved it out of a language and a sort of easy evocation of triumphs, whereas the initial moment still could retain some of that. But it's so there are clear connections or analogies with that now, right? One of the things that's striking to me, so the other day, well, a year ago, the disaster, the San Juan earthquake happened on January 15th, 1944. A year ago, in the second week of January, a few days later, there was an earthquake in San Juan in the middle of the pandemic. Not January not being in the southern hemisphere the worst moment. This is the middle of summer,
Right.
So it doesn't have the sort of the same kind of seasonality, right, that we've seen with COVID. Well, the seasonality does not play out the same in summer, so this wasn't a moment of kind of as bad as January 2021 was here.
Right.
But this was a smaller scale disaster, but it did knock down several hundred homes. It was a pretty significant. It was a sort of I can't remember the exact measurement of the earthquake, but it was stronger than the 1944 earthquake. Fortunately, no one was killed, but there were, as I say, significant destruction. So the president, Alberto Fernandez, went to San Juan and gave a speech about, evoking the earthquake, evoking rebuilding in this giant building, which is the kind of last, which was only finished in the 2000s, but which was the kind of last piece of the rebuilding project, and is sort of known as such. So like all of the connections and all of the sort of links to, we need to rebuild our nation just as we did then. And, we're facing another challenge, all of that sort of stuff was in there. And I wrote a little piece for a newspaper about that, kind of, drawing out some of the connections and contrasts, that this might be a moment to recover things, because this was a moment within the pandemic in Argentina when it was already clear that the kind of early tough lockdown attempts were failing, that the government's response was inadequate, and they needed to kind of find a new strategy. So this was a possible refounding moment, and here he is at the site of this refounding and so forth. And basically, sort of 2 weeks later, no one remembered anything about it. And he returned to Buenos Aires, and the government kind of continued on that path, which has been, better than the U.S., but not, I would say, successful. So this past week, another colleague wrote a long, really wonderful, sort of thoughtful piece in response to the President Fernandez's opening of the year of the congressional session, sort of the equivalent of a State of the Union speech. Which was really about sort of grievable lives. And he drew this analogy and kind of drew a whole riff from what I had done in the book about the San Juan earthquake and the importance of that in the making of Peronism, and that the importance had to do with Perón's effectiveness in connecting grief, leadership, and transformation, and in kind of responding to recognizing mistakes and adjusting and kind of building a collective project. And he wanted to draw a contrast with what he, I think, reasonably saw as the failures of Fernandez and of his predecessor, the other Peronist presidents of the past decades, Nestor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, in responding to a couple of other tragedies, a massive nightclub fire in Buenos Aires in the early 2000s, and a major train wreck that was partly the result of corruption a decade ago. And this kind of, and a recent spout of drug poisonings that there have been in Buenos Aires. So it was an interesting sort of attempt to kind of think about, what lives are grievable, what lives get mentioned, how we think about these things, what kind of project is. But the thing that was really fascinating for me about this article was there was no mention of COVID. So even in this context, even as he's talking about and even where there is, there has been a recognizable failure of the government and of the opposition. I mean, a sort of societal challenge, right, that Argentina, like, most other countries of the world, has not been fully up to. That, which remains the continuing problem, where there's still hundreds of people dying, from this colleague who's extremely thoughtful about these things. And so I feel like there's a really interesting question there about why we're failing to find a kind of common language to respond to this. And Fernandez himself, the president, was very effective in political communication at the beginning of the pandemic about these sorts of things. And then, as the response, as the sort of disease made its way into different cracks at Argentine society and the kind of idea of COVID zero, fell away and so forth, we never found another language. And it's just, it's striking. And it's striking, in the context of this Ed Young piece and this kind of moment that we seem to have arrived of where we've sort of lost our ability to really speak in a collectively meaningful way about the trauma towards purpose, right? The thing that had happened after this earthquake, the thing that has happened after various, that we could tell a sort of related story about Chile's history with seismic disaster, where there's a way of kind of building on that experience of shared tragedy to build strength of the state, to build community resilience, to develop sort of modes of response and, expert knowledges and so forth. And we've had some instances of that throughout COVID, but somehow the experience of these 2 years has so eroded our capacity to really articulate that as a project. It's striking.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to think a little bit more about that because I've been, you've articulated it really well. I mean, I think and it has something to do with time and disaster and the fixation of governments. And this is many different governments around the world historically, particularly in the 20th century, to focus on events. I mean, the way you were talking about the political opportunity of the 1944 earthquake and how the disaster itself is a scaffold in a sense for something else which emerges out of it. And then later we get to rebuilding, and that's another story. Okay. But I've been thinking about COVID a lot in this way because I wanted to think about COVID and authoritarianism more generally. Yeah. And that at some point, disasters that the time, if they last a long time, if their origins are murky or contested, and when they then cross, if you have a democracy at least, which is sharing power, or not a democracy and power changes for other reasons, and the disaster somehow goes across those regimes, it also becomes complicated and confusing. So when the disaster becomes a sort of the condition that you live in, then, and we see this all the time, even President, Biden, I mean, they still talk about COVID, but I don't hear the kind of, I hear closure talk, I hear normalcy talk, and you look at the numbers, you're like, guys, these numbers are worse than the first 6 months. I don't know we're coming close to 1 million deaths. We've surely gone past it, but recorded in the United States. I'm having the same cognitive dissonance here in South Korea. Just had an election last night. The conservative candidate won. We have more cases here. It's a lot smaller scale. They've managed it pretty well, but still, this is the worst moment in the whole pandemic in Korea. And it's become an issue it's just the condition of living. And so I wonder, and I don't know what to make of that necessarily in terms of like what that means in terms of policy action, like what can you do? How can you intervene? with that, but it's
Mm.
a really interesting observation you're drawing us to, that somehow, and I'm putting this on time, but maybe there's other factors, that somehow if it stretches beyond a certain period of time, disasters that we might usually have called a natural disaster or an emergency like a pandemic, it becomes something else. It just becomes something, a way people live. I mean, do you see that connection to authoritarianism in Latin America, or am I making too much of that?
I mean, so well, two things. I mean, it's the what you're saying there about the timing, right? I mean, like in that is actually the meaning of endemic, right? I mean, that this whole question of like when the thing becomes like endemic in some sense is that. I mean, it's the moment when the kind of efficacy of developing a language around shared response fails, right? When you no longer feel like you can kind of collectively organize or define the kind of object of intervention, whether it's of kind of community response or of public health strategies or of governmental strategies or what have you. Like that is one way of thinking of endemicity, right? It's just as resignation, as sort of pushing on a string, right? And that's what I mean, obviously, and we see this in the U.S. that's also a choice. So on the connection with authoritarianism, I think so. There's there's the one side of it, which is always the thing that we all kind of know about disasters, right? That although there are all of these processes of community organization response that turn out to be the most effective ways of local response to disasters, and all of the kind of spontaneous sense making and so forth, in Rebecca Solnit's version as most optimistic, right? But along with that, there always has been this kind of desire for finding someone to, as Giuliani as the 9/11 mayor, right? And it wasn't that he was any good at leadership. It was just that he was good at projecting the kind of leadership that certain sectors thought that they needed. The wonderful phrase, a small man in search of a balcony, right? So
truly Giuliani.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like there's some of that, right? There's something about the response that certain sectors within society are always going to look for those sorts of responses. So it plays into authoritarianism in that way, and certainly it plays into authoritarianism in that that other strategies of response show limited efficacy, so that heightens it. There's also this, there's this other piece of it that I suppose I hadn't fully grasped beforehand, which is we see this most richly in the U.S. or in Brazil, perhaps, but worldwide, of the kind of language of response to authoritarianism, like, I need my freedom, the anti-vaxxing language and so forth, as a vehicle for very powerful strategies of authoritarianism, right? Which has this sort of terrifying, wonderful, recursive quality, which we, in Brazil, it seems to have run its course, right? Bolsonaro has obviously, to evidence of almost everyone, objectively failed. Various other Brazilian institutions, not so much the democratic institutions, but scientific institutions and so forth, have stood up to him and are producing their own version of vaccine, have managed to get pretty high levels of community vaccination, and within this general horror have somehow built out a response. So in that sense, the sort of authoritarian response has been discredited. But more broadly, you look across Latin America, and there's still, they're in Peru or in Ecuador. There are lots of spaces where there has been this kind of collapse of the political imagination. There hasn't really been anything to emerge. I mean, there are more hopeful stories to be told about Chile, and to a degree, Colombia, right? I mean, we'll see where things go, but the kind of time-honored solutions of authoritarian response in Colombia have been very ineffective in either responding to COVID or really all the kind of other related social trauma and upheaval, that in a way that has really discredited the kind of existing political order. And in Chile and Colombia, you see that producing kind of new political possibilities. So it's I mean,
Yeah.
if we look around the continent, it's a very mixed bag. But certainly, the kinds of kind of community-led responses and sort of NGO-led, grassroots democracy and things that had been somewhat successful in the past and that we might have hoped for more responses out of, have not been the dominant note, shall we say.
Let me remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Mark Healey. Mark, I'd like to be a little greedy with your time. Can you stay a little bit longer?
Sure.
Okay. You never know with a department head what's happening. I know it's night.
We had a 2-hour meeting today.
Oh, you paid in advance.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I'm keeping you from your beer or your soda, but I want to go a little bit further with this because I want to think about memory with you a little bit.
Yeah.
Because when I spent a little time in Chile with brilliant colleagues there like Roberto Morris and so the history of disasters was always under discussion.
Yeah.
And it's earthquakes and tsunami, of course, and Manuel Tironi and all of the colleagues there at Sigaden at the Catholic University. I mean, they're constantly working on sort of contemporary, culture of managerialism and engineering as a way to cope with the ongoing threat of disaster in Chile. But you're always just one lunchtime conversation away from the Valdivia earthquake.
Right.
And the way people talk in intermingled ways about those, and as we've been talking about that earthquake, and then the state, that earthquake and authoritarianism, that and Pinochet is always, that discussion is always there.
Right.
And similar to the way, conversations with colleagues in Germany, you may have had a similar, experience with. I had a colleague tell me this once over lunch. She said, "Look, the Holocaust is the disaster." She said, "The Holocaust is the big disaster. You let any conversation about contemporary disaster management in Germany, refugee crisis, whatever it is, what's going on now in Ukraine, let people talk long enough and you get to that."
Right.
And so I'm thinking about that in terms of memory right now, what you were just talking about with COVID. And the problem of remembering a disaster in the middle of it, okay, that makes sense. But I'm deeply worried we won't have the tools to remember it even 5 years from now, in part for a lot of complicated reasons, the scale of it, the global nature of it, but also the downplaying of it intentionally by many governments around the world. So what can we draw from that struggle over memory in countries like Argentina or Chile, where it's an ongoing struggle, not only to name names and find bodies, but also develop a sort of national space for memory? Can we draw anything from that to help us now as we think about COVID memorialization?
I think it's interesting. We were slight detour. As you were thinking about that, I was thinking about I was living in New York in 2001, and I remember being struck in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 by the kind of spontaneous emergence of these kind of walls of memorial pictures, right? Especially, around Union Square, but there are other places too, right? Where places that became sites of memory, and which then, after some time, Giuliani had purged. But which were extremely evocative for me of what those memory sites and of that memory work from in the sort of post-dictatorship memory, right? It was always, a sort of a single candid snapshot, looking for the disappeared and so forth. So that had me thinking, then about this kind of question of, the way that memory becomes tangled up in these and the dangers of that, right? I mean, clearly, like, this was a disorderly memory to kind of keep in the public space, right? And therefore, there was a need to kind of discipline it, focus it, and, as it turned out, militarize it, right? In the response within New York. So in thinking about what certainly all of Latin American societies that were subject to, more or less intense versions of state terrorism. And it came out of the experience with powerful democratic movements and with memory as this really central value of democracy. So you did see, as a result of that being a kind of broader set of practices, you did see some attempts to kind of take those tools and those experiences and apply them early on in the pandemic to thinking about this traumatic experience. But I feel like, and so one place where that has really kind of taken off is Brazil, because there is a sort of clear political intentionality, right, about the ways that Bolsonaro ignored or discounted or subverted attempts to respond to COVID. In his kind of general sort of politicization of the public sphere, and the ways in which sort of resistance and attempts at community care, corresponded somewhat with resistance to Bolsonaro and insistence on the sort of the longer tradition of Brazilian public health and science, in ways that have yielded some result of that, right? Some reckoning of names, some recounting of names, some sort of politics of memory. So I feel like that is one place where you can see that, and where that may well lead to, if, as things seem to suggest, Lula returns to the presidency, a kind of language of shared suffering. And certainly in Lula's speeches, there has been, a lot of reference to that, that can be turned into some kind of, attempt to keep alive this memory, and also to turn it into a broader intervention to build a more robust system of care and public health, and to attend to all of the vast inequalities that were evident before but have been deepened by this experience. In Argentina, I don't know that there's been. It's a strange thing, because the national conversation is still kind of dominated by, understandably, by some metaphors that draw on the dictatorship and memory struggles after. I think part of the problem is that a number of the people who've been, one narrow problem is a number of the people who are kind of associated with the government and on the left and or connected with the Peronist administration, who had been in human rights work, were themselves sort of discredited in various ways. I mean, famously, one kind of key figure in the human rights movement was chosen sort of partly through his own doing for vaccination early on in a kind of VIP vaccination program. And, I mean, he's in his 80s, like, it wasn't that egregious of a violation. They got to vaccinating everybody else relatively soon, but the idea that you're the sort of champion of the dispossessed and of human rights, and you're sort of taking a special route to get secret protection for yourself, did not sit well. So there are ways in which some of this kind of older language of care and older language of human rights has been partly, or at least some of the leaders of that have been kind of politicized in particular ways and discredited. And so I think there hasn't yet been an emergence of a kind of clear way of connecting to that experience. Also because in contrast with Brazil, I mean, people may have dispute different things about how the government responded, but particularly during the kind of first year or so, like, there wasn't actually that much daylight between the government and opposition in terms of how to respond. And it's only over time, and that's had to do with the kind of clumsiness of some things like this VIP vaccination thing or other stuff. None of which is, but which mostly has been evidence of a kind of, failed imagination, failed capacity to connect with citizenship and so forth, more than willful failure. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, but it just feels like it kind of falls away from like a clear, larger political meaning. Like, it sort of becomes this sort of personal, kind of isolated personal experience of this broad societal tragedy. I think there is important work to be done to try to make sense of that in developing some common response going forward. It'll be interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out on the Chilean side, because of course Chile had experienced this uprising, massive protest, and kind of societal insurrection starting in October 2019. And so when the pandemic happened, it kind of hit a society that was partly an open revolt, partly under martial law, still processing this thing. And although Piñera's government, the vaccination program is about the only thing that it did well, and it's during Piñera's term. But the fact that it did that well in the middle of what continued to be an ongoing public health tragedy, and this moment of just enormous political dissent, struggle, reinvention, it'll be interesting to see, as now Chile is writing a new constitution, has a new government that's coming to power later this month, and it's just a much more kind of hopeful vision for the future. In truth, I haven't seen, even Boric, whose sort of speeches and campaign has really been kind of masterful in capturing the ways that personal experience and individual suffering has not been accounted for in the Chilean polity. But it hasn't had a particularly strong COVID vector, right? It's COVID has sort of exemplified these kind of broader problems that go further back. So I think that's also, so if on the one hand, in the Argentine case, it's kind of fallen out of a larger political scheme. In the Chilean case, it kind of reinforces this larger political scheme in creative ways, and in ways which might, I think, produce some interesting new kind of memory work and political imagination, and hopefully, public health institutions.
It's thank you for talking about that, and I was also in New York in 2001, and I wish I knew you then. I did not have the knowledge. So my visits to Union Square, I was seeing those forms of memory for the first time. I didn't have the knowledge of the Argentine or the Chilean case, with the photo, the candle, the flower. This kind of language. I'll just a little aside. I was telling this story recently to a student. I went looking with Charles Strozier. We went looking around 2004 for whatever the city had kept of that memorial in Union Square. Because to me, that was the best memorial, and it will never be reproduced. It was spontaneous. It was loving. It was performative. It was great and important. And then the city unceremoniously came along and cleaned it all up one day. And so, but in the city archives of New York, when we went looking, there was a long-suffering archivist there who said, "Yeah, there's some things over here you could look in that file cabinet." Whatever. We opened the file cabinet; it was full of flowers. The little bouquets you buy at the bodega. They're all just dried and crumbly, just thrown in there. That's the nature of the archiving. But it moved me. I mean, I was like distraught by that. It's like, wow, this is an important moment in New York's history. It's sitting here in this file cabinet. I'm just about pulling that out and feeling things falling. It's incredibly powerful. Yeah, but the other what you were talking about before. I mean, I think this is to me, this is again. I think this is productive for us to work with this and think about this, because part of the challenge of the memory of life under a police state and crimes against humanity, a lot of that becomes sort of judicial. It becomes sort of focused on a criminal justice process, a fact-finding process, and that becomes sort of that's where money flows, and that becomes a focus where people can say, okay, we need to do the memory work here because that's part of a justice process. But sometimes that focuses people's attention on bad guys and on this idea that justice can be attained through something that happens in a courtroom, and it's unsatisfying, I think, to many people, because it leaves out the sort of just broader era of suffering. And the fact that it's shared across political party and across a long time. And COVID in some ways is the opposite problem. It's like, I mean, we can point to injustices, certainly, but it will be hard to ever bring Bolsonaro or Trump up on some kind of charges, for crime against humanity with COVID, whether or not you think they should be or not. And so because that part of the process will always be missing, then we just have to rely on the other part, which is just, well, here's an era of suffering. Document
it. Right. No, exactly.
Good luck.
Yeah. What's the narrative thread other than pain? Yeah.
Yeah. We should close up. There's one other thing I just wanted to ask you. You've been writing about Mapuche history and indigenous history in Argentina, and I wanted to just get an update. Have you been following what's been going on with Mapuche in COVID? I mean, there've been a few news stories here and there. I haven't been able to follow it very well.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been, right. So on the one hand, right. So there's an Argentine story. There's a Chilean story, right, which Mapuches have a kind of larger political presence. I mean, they're just like a kind of great specter haunting the Chilean state, and sort of continued victims of really the persistence of authoritarian practices in democracy, right? I mean, the kind of states of siege, including very recently. On the Argentine side, there is a quite active movement. There has been there have tended to be kind of more schools, more public health, more, not that there aren't also violences, and under the last government there were several sort of persecutions and various legal cases and some killings. But there has been kind of more integration into kind of community institutions and access to things. The kind of area of Patagonia, which where you have most of the sort of Pehuenche, Tehuelche, Mapuche populations, has broadly more public health infrastructure and so forth, with all kinds of limits. So on the Argentine side, it's sort of more like what the story has been in Patagonia generally. So you find there have been, certainly like in the kind of poorer neighborhoods, which are heavily Mapuche of Bariloche, there have been, you've seen greater patterns of infection. There have been, all the sort of processes. But broadly, it's been kind of part of a broader Argentine story. And on the Chilean side, it's been connected with lots of political insurgency related to, earlier things, but then have continued after October 2019. The government has reimposed a state of siege a couple of times. And there were numerous killings of Mapuche youth during the insurrection. So what we see, I think, is less. You haven't seen the kind of level of difference in vulnerability that we saw, with indigenous populations in the U.S. early on in the pandemic, right? Certainly greater among indigenous populations in both Argentina and Chile, but not quite on the scale of the U.S. But what you have seen is a kind of really interesting kind of political imagination, as also is in the case of indigenous communities in the U.S., around kind of community health and so forth. And so one of the things I think that'll be really striking to see is that, right, the questions of Mapuche rights are really and Mapuche language, right? From the president of the Chilean Constitutional Convention down to other representatives who have been elected and really taken the kind of questions of indigenous sovereignty and indigenous rights to the kind of heart of discussions in the new Constitutional Convention. So it'll be striking to see, how these experiences of exclusion, these kind of demands, for autonomy, but also for rights and access to the welfare state, play out in the kind of the ongoing constitutional process now, nearing its tentative end. I think that's really kind of one of the promising things is the ways in which indigenous identity has been mobilized has been a kind of great energy, right? Famously, like a number of the pictures of the kind of insurrection in October, November 2019 were the kind of flying the Mapuche flag in the center of Santiago, and clearly kind of connecting with that and reconnecting with that indigenous history, both for those who are members of indigenous communities and for the kind of broader Chilean population who have kind of come to think differently about indigeneity within Chile is a really interesting fruit of these days. We'll see.
Well, we should wrap up. I just want to remind folks that you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls live at 7 p.m. Eastern time, although we are running COVID Calls all times of the day and night right now. And The next COVID Calls episode, actually, you can catch at 10 a.m. on March 10th, which I'll be speaking with a physician from Ukraine. So please do join me for that. It'll be a little early in the morning, U.S. East Coast time, but I'll make sure to post information about that in the next couple of hours. I just got confirmation that's going to happen. And want to thank my guest, Mark Healey. This is what I needed. A long talk with a great historian. That's what I needed today. And you really delivered it. Thanks, Mark, for your work and for this time. I really appreciate it.
It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.